Nelson Rockefeller's death was one of the biggest scandals of the 1970s, and to this day, no one truly knows how one of the most powerful men on earth actually died. Was it a heart attack or something more sinister? Everyone knows the name Rockefeller, but many today probably have no idea who Nelson was, so we'll give a quick bio and then we'll get into his very strange death. Obviously, Nelson was part of the famed Rockefeller family and inherited ridiculous wealth from his grandfather, the richest man of all time. Rockefeller's focus was politics. He used his money to fund candidates and was involved in every presidential administration from that era. He also served as governor of New York from 1959 to 1973, but by all accounts, his one obsession was becoming president of the US, and he ran for president 3 times. But each presidential bid was a miserable failure, and Rockefeller's lifelong ambition appeared to be over. But when Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 due to Watergate, his VP Gerald Ford became president and named Rockefeller his vice president.
I, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Nelson Rockefeller will, along with Gerald Ford, become the first team of president and vice president ever to serve this country who have not been elected by the people.
Within a year, there were 2 assassination attempts on Ford's life. The first came on September 5th, 1975. The next came barely 2 weeks later on September 22nd.
Her name is Sarah Moore. She is the second woman to be charged with attempted murder of the president in the last 17 days.
Then Ford's presidential limo was in a suspicious car crash a month after that. Had Ford lost his life in any of the 3 events, Rockefeller would have basically been handed the presidency without ever having won a national election, which is just wild to think about. A sitting US president almost losing his life 3 times in the span of a month is without question highly suspicious. There have always been rumors that Rockefeller, who was described as being basically psychotic in his obsession with becoming president, was behind the assassination attempts. So that's Nelson Rockefeller's life, but we're more interested in his death. Rockefeller died on Friday, January 26, 1979 in New York City. The first report said that he was working late at 30 Rockefeller Plaza and died of a heart attack at 10:15 p.m. But the next day the story changed. Rockefeller was actually at a townhome he owned on 54th Street, not at Rockefeller Center, when he suffered the heart attack. Now, the scene of the death is a pretty major detail to get wrong, and people started questioning whether there was more to the story. Then that next day, the story changed again. The third story in 3 days offered up a surprise twist. A girl was involved. The latest story was now that Rockefeller ate dinner with his family, then had a 25-year-old employee named Megan Marshack come over to his townhome to help him, quote, work on an art book at 10 p.m. on a Friday night. After Rockefeller's heart attack, Marshack was the one who called 911. This surprise twist went off like a bomb. Overnight, Megan Marshack became the talk of the nation. There were constant jokes about her on Johnny Carson and SNL's Weekend Update. The most interesting detail that emerged was that Megan Marshack's 911 call was placed at 11:16, but Rockefeller's heart attack occurred at 10:15. Every second matters after a heart attack, so why had a full hour passed until 911 was called? What happened in that mysterious hour? Could his life have been saved if 911 had been called immediately? Throughout the confusion, the press tried to find Megan Marshack to get some answers, but no one could find her. She had vanished off the face of the earth. Then the strange story got even stranger when it was learned that there was a second woman involved in Rockefeller's death. Ponchitta Pierce, a television anchor in New York, had placed the 911 call, not Megan Marshack.
We'll be right back.
Pierce and Marshack both lived at 25 West 54th Street in a co-op owned by Rockefeller, just a few doors down from his townhome. Once again, the official story changed. The fourth official story in a week was that Rockefeller suffered a heart attack at 10:15 and Marshack called her friend Ponchitta Pierce instead of calling 911. Pierce then walked over to Rockefeller's townhome and the 2 ladies did something for nearly an hour and no one really knew what. And finally, at 11:16, a full hour after Rockefeller's heart attack, Pierce called 911. And then, unbelievably, she simply left the townhome before police arrived, leaving her friend Marshack alone with Rockefeller, who was either already dead or dying at that point. Megan Marshack was still missing, and Pierce became the target of questions about that night. She was asked about the mysterious hour that passed and why she simply left her friend Marshack alone with Rockefeller's corpse, and she was very evasive with her answers. Another very suspicious fact that emerged was that Rockefeller's body was cremated barely 24 hours after his death, which made it impossible to perform an autopsy. There was confusion about what time he'd actually died, and there were rumors that he hadn't even died of a heart attack. He'd been assassinated or poisoned, and the whole thing was being covered up. An autopsy could have determined the cause and time of his death, but that was now impossible after Rockefeller's body was so quickly cremated. Even shadier, Michael Baden was the one who oversaw the cremation. Now, there is a ton out there on Michael Baden, and we won't get into him here. Just know that he's a pathologist who's been involved in autopsies and investigations in nearly every high-profile death over the past 4 decades. Many people believe he is corrupt as they come, and he's the pathologist that very powerful people use when they want things covered up in murder investigations. The fact that he just happened to be the guy involved in Nelson Rockefeller's rush cremation is suspicious, to say the least. To understand the true impact of Rockefeller's death, you must first understand just how powerful the Rockefellers were during this era. At the time, there were 5 Rockefeller brothers. The brothers each used their massive inherited wealth to make the Rockefeller dynasty a dominant factor in every economic, political, and social category. David was chairman of the ultra-powerful Chase Manhattan Bank. Lawrence focused on aerospace and technology and was an initial investor in companies like Apple and Intel. John III focused on economically taking over foreign countries, mostly in Africa and Asia. Nelson focused on national politics. Obviously, he became vice president and nearly became president. And Winthrop focused on rural politics and was governor of Arkansas in the 1960s and 1970s. Collectively, they had ridiculous power, but that's only part of the story. Their true power came from their control over the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a secretive organization that's comprised of basically everyone who's anyone. Billionaires and CEOs, US presidents and world leaders, tons of politicians, and most every journalist you can imagine. The CFR wields so much power that it's been described as an unelected super government whose power is far, far greater than that of the elected government. The Rockefeller brothers basically ran the CFR during this era, and David was the chairman from 1970 to 1985. The Rockefellers also founded and oversaw the Trilateral Commission, another secretive group of international power players. In his memoirs, former Senator Barry Goldwater described the Trilateral Commission. What the Trilateralists intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political governments of the world. As managers and creators of this system, they will rule the future. And the Rockefellers were heavily involved in the third major group, the Bilderberg meetings. All 3 of these groups have a ridiculous amount of power and influence, and the Rockefeller brothers basically ran all 3 during this era. So when Winthrop Rockefeller died in the mid-1970s, then John died in a suspicious car crash in 1978, and Nelson died a few months later in 1979, it wasn't just the death of a few billionaires. It marked a serious blow to a family dynasty that wielded tremendous power on a national and international stage. Between the constantly changing story, the mysterious hour that passed until 911 was called, and the rushed cremation, there were a ton of rumors about Rockefeller's death. Still to this day, the official story is that he died while working on an art book with a 25-year-old aide at 10 p.m. on a Friday night. Now, obviously, there were rumors that he died while having sex, but there were also rumors that he'd been murdered. Someone this powerful has a lot of enemies, and there were so many aspects of the official story that just didn't make any sense. Something was clearly being covered up. Legendary researcher Mae Brussel thought that Rockefeller's death was just as controversial and impactful as JFK's assassination 15 years earlier, and she believed it was a murder.
I'm convinced Nelson Rockefeller was murdered.
She felt there was far, far more to the story of Megan Marshack and Ponchitta Pierce. Both women had worked for Rockefeller, and both women also lived in a condo building owned by Rockefeller that was just 2 doors down from his townhome in a very, very expensive area of Manhattan. Brussel wondered if this building that Marshack and Pierce lived in was used by Rockefeller and the CIA for blackmail.
A big answer to this puzzle is the house on 25 West 54th Street that Ponchitta Pierce lives in with Megan Marshack. I'm wondering if the motive for covering this whole thing up is, could that location, that co-op next door, be a front for the Central Intelligence Agency or the Defense Department that Rockefeller used? Or was it where he personally fixed up ambassadors and people that visited New York City business contracts? That's how Howard Hughes got his contracts, fixing up all the military with various women And then he had them, he not only blackmailed them, but he could seduce them and get these huge contracts. That is public record.
Blackmail has been used in both political and economic circles for a long, long time. It's so prevalent in politics, it's been said that blackmail is what makes Washington, D.C. operate.
They have places in Washington, D.C., and I guess New York too, and women of all kinds and food, and they get the congressman to bed, photograph them, and tape record them, and then the next day they play it back to them. And Ted Patrick claims that there's at least 100 men in Congress that are in the control now because of this blackmail that has been going on. It's so rampant.
Ponchitta Pierce has always been a mystery. Why did Megan Marshack call her instead of calling 911? What did they do in the hour that passed until they called 911? And why did Pierce simply leave the townhome after calling 911, leaving her friend Marshack alone with Rockefeller's dead or dying body?
She was under the pay of Rockefeller at one time, and she was Megan Marshack's best friend, and leaves her alone with a man who is A, either dying, or B, dead, and walks out to her apartment and goes back upstairs. Now, that is impossible. That is a total impossible arrangement unless they work for the Defense Department. That I believe Ponchitta Pierce was an agent of the CIA or the Defense Department, and I felt that Ponchitta was called by Megan Marshack because she had to say, I did the job. Ponchitta looked at it, agreed, okay, called 911 and went out. They said, did you know if he was alive or dead? She said, I didn't even ask.
If Rockefeller was murdered, who was behind the whole thing? What was the motive? Brussels believed there was essentially a split in the Republican Party heading into the 1980 election. Some wanted Ronald Reagan, and Rockefeller wanted to use his money and power to back another candidate. The Reagan gang murdered Rockefeller to pave the way for Reagan to become the Republican nominee in 1980.
I believe that Ronald Reagan was selected a long time ago to be president, and anybody who stands in his way can be eliminated. There is a big split going on in the politics at the highest level, and I would say it's Cyrus Vance and Kissinger and the Nelson Rockefellers versus Brzezinski, Reagan, Ronald Reagan, Paul Assault, Bush, John Connally, and those people that are gunning for World War III.
And then there is the involvement of pathologist Michael Baden, who a few years earlier was called as an expert in the House Select Committee on Assassinations and was accused by many of misinterpreting the evidence in the JFK assassination to help cover it up. If Rockefeller had died of a heart attack, there was no reason for the rushed cremation that Baden oversaw. But if Rockefeller had been poisoned, as some suggested at the time, a cremation would cover up any evidence.
If he's capable of covering up the Kennedy assassination and a $6 million investigation, he's capable of covering up the murder of Nelson Rockefeller.
Another explanation came from author Trumbull Higgins, who claimed Rockefeller had actually died at Marshack's apartment. The hour that passed was spent moving the body to his townhome. Writer Dr. Peter David Beater claimed Rockefeller had been murdered by Russian agents as part of the Cold War conflict. Beater claimed Rockefeller's time spent with Marshack was known as one of the only times he was without his heavy security staff, leaving him open to murder. The real story may never be known. In 1992, Megan Marshack supposedly resurfaced for the first time in 15 years and refused to comment about Rockefeller's death, leaving the many questions about that night still unanswered.